There's something seductive about convenience, the kind that slowly pulls you in until you're trapped inside its web. After I moved out on my own, it became a way of life. Not that I was lazy per se, I just had a good job, a social life, all the things a normal 20-something should. But if I could avoid dealing with the outside world, I definitely would. I'd pay extra for Uber rides, grocery deliveries, and food drop-offs just to stay in my little bubble. I didn't think of it as laziness, it was just comfort. It started off small, an Uber ride here, a grocery run there. But once I realized how easy it was to avoid those mundane interactions of everyday life, I really leaned into it. I didn't have to stand in line at a supermarket or deal with the chatty clerks. I didn't have to make small talk with people who barely even knew me. Delivery services became my crutch, and soon I was using them for everything. And it wasn't long before I found myself rarely even leaving the house. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, a little post-pandemic recluse period to unwind. Everybody was still figuring out how to be normal again after COVID, right? Staying in felt safe, and I liked safe. Eventually, it wasn't just about avoiding the outside world. It was just about enjoying being alone. I kept my job, managed friendships over text, and spent most of my weekends just me and my puppy, curled up on the couch binge-watching shows. Alone time literally became my sanctuary. One weekend, I had it all planned out, total isolation. I was gonna devour the latest season of my favorite Netflix show without any distractions. I had snacks, drinks, blankets, and my puppy on my lap. It was gonna be perfect. The only thing missing was a burrito from my favorite Mexican restaurant down the street. Nothing too extravagant, just a fat carnitas burrito with chips and guacamole to carry me throughout that night. It was already around 8 p.m. The sun had set, and a comfortable darkness had settled up over my living room, the soft glow of the TV flickering in front of me. I opened up the food delivery app, placed the order, and of course, selected the no contact option. It was one of those weekends. No socializing, no interruptions, not even with the delivery driver. Just drop the food off, snap a picture, and go. Perfect. The order was accepted pretty quickly, and then I was given an ETA of 20 minutes. I settled back in the couch, pressing play on the TV, glancing occasionally at my phone to watch the delivery's progress. 20 minutes came and went, with no knock, no notification, nothing. I waited around another 5 minutes, then maybe 10. My phone buzzed. It was finally the delivery driver. "Hey, sorry for the delay. There was a mix-up at the restaurant, but don't worry, I got it fixed, and I'm on my way now." A sense of relief quickly washed over me, though I will admit something about the situation felt off. I don't know why. I thanked him and reminded him that it was a no-contact order. I did not want to be disturbed, especially since I was already in my don't talk to me mode. I didn't get a response. I kept watching my show, but my focus would continue to drift. Time continued to tick by, and that uneasy feeling from earlier began creeping back in. It wasn't just the delay, it was something in his tone, or maybe the lack of a tone. There was no "sorry for the wait" or "hope you enjoy," just that curt "I'm on my way." The headlights cut through the living room window and finally snapped me out of it. I muted the TV and listened for the usual footsteps, a bag being set down and then retreating steps. But instead, all I heard was silence. I stared at the door, feeling that growing tightness in my chest. He should have been gone by now, but something was keeping him there. I debated peeking through my window, but it felt like I was giving too much away. Instead, I grabbed my phone and pulled up my feed from my Ring camera. He was just standing there, just outside the door, holding the bag and not moving, not knocking, just standing. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. He was frozen, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for something. 5 minutes went by, then 10. He didn't move an inch. My heart was thudding now, that uneasy feeling turning into full-blown dread. This wasn't normal. I hesitated before sending him a message. I did not want to engage, but I wanted to get rid of him, so I typed out, "Hey, it's no contact. Please just leave my food on the porch." Seconds later, I received a reply. I need you to come out and take it. I can't leave until you do. I stared at the text, my fingers now trembling. I double-checked the app, confirming that I had indeed selected no contact. Why was he insisting on seeing me? The knot in my stomach tightened even more. Just leave it, I replied. It's already paid for. You don't need to confirm anything. I didn't get a response. I checked the Ring camera again, and this time he was looking directly into it now. His eyes almost seemed hollow, his face stretched into this grotesque, forced smile, and that's when he spoke. You should come out and take it. I just want to make sure you get it. His voice was monotone, flat, emotionless. But there was something beneath it, something sinister lurking just out of reach. Every instinct that I had screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and turn off the lights. He wasn't leaving. He was just waiting for me, watching. I typed out another message, hands shaking. I really don't want to come out. Please just leave my food. This time he didn't reply through text though. Instead, he spoke directly into the camera once more. Come on. I can see the glow from your TV. It'll just take a second. What are you watching? His tone had shifted now, more casual, like we were old friends sharing a conversation. But those words made my skin crawl. How long had he been standing out there, watching through my window? I felt my breath hitch as I backed away from the door. The air inside my apartment now feeling heavy, suffocating even. My puppy was stirring on the couch, quickly sensing my tension. And then he said, I had to go through a lot to fix your order, you know. Maybe you could at least come out and say thank you. The words just lingered in the air, an unspoken threat behind them. I swallowed hard and tried to think of what to do. Clearly, he wasn't going to leave on his own, but I didn't really want to open the door. I didn't want to see him in person, but my options were quickly running out. Fine, I muttered to myself under my breath, hands still trembling as I unlocked the door. I pulled it open just a crack, enough to meet his gaze. He had this weird smirk, unnatural, especially up close. It was almost like it was painted on. And his skin had this unhealthy pale sheen to it. And the smell, oh my God, the smell hit me like a wave. Stale sweat, dirt, and something rotten lingering beneath it. He then extended the bag toward me, but didn't let go of it. I felt an icy wave of fear wash over me as I reached out, and it almost seemed like his grip tightened on the bag. I think I deserve more than just a thank you, he said, voice dripping with something oily. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning my face. Maybe you could invite me inside. My pulse started racing. I forced a fake smile, stepping back and tightening my grip on the door handle. I can't do that, I stammered out. My roommate's really sick and no one's allowed inside. There was no roommate. I lived alone, but I needed him to leave. His eyes then flicked over my shoulder, towards the dim glow of the TV in the background. Your roommate? He asked, smile faltering. That's funny. I haven't seen anybody else here all night. I froze, blood running cold. He hadn't just been standing at my door, he'd clearly been watching the house. As my heart pounded, my skin began to crawl with the realization that this man knew more about me than I ever should have let him know. This needed to end, now. I'm sorry, but I need to get back to them, I said, voice shaky but firm. Please, just leave my food. He hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating his next move, and then, in an instant, he lunged. His hand slammed into me, forcing me back as he shoved his way inside. The stench of him completely overwhelmed me. It was sour and putrid. I screamed, throwing my weight against the door with all the strength that I could muster up. He was definitely stronger than I expected him to be, his dirty hands clawing at the door frame, but somehow, fueled by sheer panic, I managed to push him out. The door slammed shut and I locked it. My whole body was shaking as I braced myself against it. I just stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of his footsteps retreating down the stairs. I ran to the window just in time to see him jogging back to his car and looking over his shoulder as he went. I stayed by the door waiting for the sound of his car to pull away. When I finally heard the engine rev and fade off into the distance, I slid down the door onto the floor, body trembling and adrenaline ebbing. My puppy, now really sensing my distress, licked my hand. I hugged him tight, trying to steady my breathing. For the next hour, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that it was all over, that he was gone for good. But his face, that smell, it was all just burned into my mind. The way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, deciding what to do next. I shuddered, trying to shake off the creeping terror that had now settled deep into my bones. Eventually, I stood up, my legs unsteady, and grabbed my phone. I had to report this. My fingers fumbled as I pulled up the delivery app and found the support chat. I described everything that happened, from creepy text to the attempted forced entry. The response was quick, but frustratingly vague. "We're sorry for your experience. We'll launch an investigation and take the appropriate action." That was not good enough for me, though. I called the non-emergency police line next. I wasn't sure if they could do anything, but I at least had to make some kind of report. The dispatcher was polite, though clearly indifferent. "We'll send somebody out there to take a statement," she said, her voice lacking any sense of urgency. I hung up, feeling a wave of helplessness completely wash over me. I sat back on the couch staring blankly at the TV, unable to focus on anything. The burrito and chips were still sitting on the floor near the door, untouched. The smell of the food mingled with the lingering odor of that driver. I felt sick to my stomach. I grabbed the bag of food and threw it into the trash without a second thought. My appetite was gone. When the police officer arrived about an hour later, I told him about everything. He took notes and asked a few questions, but again, didn't really seem overly concerned. We'll keep an eye out for him," he said. "But I'll admit, without any actual assault, it's hard to take any further action right now. Just stay vigilant, lock your doors, and call us if anything else happens." It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was something, I guess. I thanked him and watched him drive away, feeling no safer than I had before he even came. The rest of the night was a blur and I didn't sleep. I mean, how could I? I kept my Ring camera feed open on my phone, glancing at it every few minutes, expecting to see him standing there again. But the porch remained empty. The street remained quiet. I tried to distract myself by watching more of the show, but every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow made me think he was lurking just out of sight. The next morning I woke up, if you can even call it that. I must have dozed off at some point, but it didn't feel like real sleep. My head was throbbing, my nerves were completely shot. I glanced at my phone, half expecting more messages from him, but there was nothing. I couldn't stay trapped in fear. I had to go on with my life, right? I told myself that maybe the company had actually followed through. Maybe they suspended his account, or maybe he'd realized he'd gone too far and decided to lay low. Whatever the case, I hadn't heard from him again, so I decided to just move on. For a few days, things remained pretty quiet. I went back to work, I hung out with my friends. I tried to forget completely about that delivery driver. But I still had a nagging feeling, the sense that he was still out there watching me and had never completely left me alone. Every time I came home, I'd glance over my shoulder, checking for unfamiliar cars or people lingering nearby. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a spike of panic, half expecting it to be that delivery driver again. Then 4 days later, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I recognized the area code. My stomach dropped and I hesitated before answering. When I did, there was a silence on the other end for a moment, and then a voice.
"Hey, it's me."
It was him. I froze, the phone pressed into my ear, blood running cold.
I've been thinking about you.
He continued, voice disturbingly casual, as if we were old friends catching up.
You really seemed like you were having a good time watching that show, and I ended up checking it out myself. Pretty good, right?
My breath caught in my throat. How did he even know that? Was he watching me again? My hands began trembling again, voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? There was a pause, then that oily, smug tone returned.
I just thought maybe we could hang out sometime. I mean, we both like the same shows. It seems like we get along so well.
I couldn't even speak. The horror of everything had completely paralyzed me. He didn't see this as an intrusion. To him, this was a normal, friendly, even conversation.
I've been thinking about that night.
He went on.
I think we just got off the wrong foot. Maybe I was a little too pushy, but I was just doing my job, you know? It's hard out here, delivering food. People don't appreciate all my efforts.
I felt sick, bile rising up in my throat. I wanted to hang up, but I was frozen. My hand wouldn't even move.
So, what do you say?
He pressed on.
We could meet up. Maybe even grab a bite to eat. You still like burritos, right?
That was it, and that was my breaking point. I hung up, my entire body convulsing as I dropped the phone onto the couch. The panic surged through me like a wave, drowning out every rational thought. My fingers moving in a frantic, jerky motion. I immediately phoned the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation to them. They took the report, but the response was the same as before. They'd look into it. If you feel unsafe, we can issue a temporary protection order until we've contacted the man. Once they'd contacted him, they hadn't even found him yet. I hung up feeling utterly helpless. I couldn't just wait around for him to decide what to do next, and that could potentially be showing up again at my house. For the next few days, I was back to being on edge. I kept even more to myself, completely avoiding leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't order food, I didn't answer the door. The outside world just felt like a threat to me. Every sound was a possible warning of that man's return. The police did check in once, but it was clear they weren't making any headway. And then, one evening, it happened again. I came home from work tired and stressed out from work. And there it was, sitting on my doorstep, neatly packaged in a brown paper bag with my name on it. The same order as before. Carnitas burrito, chips, guacamole. I didn't order that. I stared at the bag, dread bubbling up inside me like acid. He was now toying with me. This wasn't just a delivery, it was a message. He knew where I lived, he knew my routine. And now, he was reminding me about that night, letting me know that he hadn't forgotten, that he could come back anytime he wanted. This time I didn't even touch the food. I didn't go near it. I locked my door and called the police immediately, hands shaking as I recounted the new development to them. This time I think they took it seriously. They sent somebody over to take formal statements, and finally, they issued a protective order. But I did not feel like it was enough. How could a piece of paper protect me from this man? As the days dragged on after that, he never came back in person, at least not that I saw. Every now and again, I would get a text from an unknown number or an email from a new account, asking if I enjoyed the show, asking if I wanted to hang out. Each time I would report it, but there was only so much authorities could really do. I'll admit and give him credit, he was slippery, careful, always staying just out of reach. Eventually, those messages did stop. Weeks passed without any sign of him, and slowly, I began to relax. Maybe he'd moved on. Maybe he'd found somebody new to torment. Whatever the case, I'm just glad that guy is gone. I worked for a small delivery company in a town where everybody knew each other's business. Delivering Delights wasn't one of those big-name services like Uber Eats or DoorDash. It was more of a homegrown operation, a private startup run by a local couple, making just enough to stay afloat. You'd think the name itself would give off a friendly vibe, but there was something about the food delivery at night that would always give me the creeps. The streets, once bustling with the daily life, had now turned shadowy and hollow underneath the dim glow of the street lamps. My job was simple: pick up food and drop it off. I'd gotten used to the rhythm, driving through quiet neighborhoods, watching people's lights flick on and off as they settled into their evening routines. Most customers were friendly, waving from their doorsteps or even offering up a thank you from behind a mask. You start to recognize people after a while. Small towns are definitely like that. I learned their habits, like the ones who ordered late-night pizzas, the families who always wanted extra fries, the guy who'd tip you $5 extra if you didn't make a sound. But, of course, there's oddballs, people who make your skin crawl. I avoided certain neighborhoods, especially after dark. But then, there was Elaine. Elaine lived in this old part of town, right near the high school, where the houses had definitely seen better days. Lawns were overgrown, neglected by their owners. She always ordered fish and chips, always. And every time, she would have the same instructions: knock and wait for her to come to the door. Pretty standard, except she'd linger. She'd invite me in with that weird grin plastered across her face, a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. I would always decline, make some excuse about having other deliveries. And there was something about the way that she looked at me, like she was sizing me up, like a wolf watching a lamb. One night when business was pretty slow, I got my notification. New order, fish and chips for Elaine. I almost skipped it. The clock read 10:15 p.m. and I only had an hour left on my shift. It was a large order though, bigger than normal. I was feeling kind of desperate to make up for the dismal tips that night. So against my better judgment, I took the call. I pulled up to the restaurant, stomach already uneasy. Street outside was dark and the flickering neon sign cast an eerie, jagged shadow across the parking lot. Even the restaurant seemed quieter than normal, almost like the whole town was asleep except for me and Elaine. I grabbed the heavy brown bag, grease already seeping through the paper, and headed for her house. Elaine's place stood out like a sore thumb in the neighborhood, a sagging 2-story house with peeling paint and half blinds torn from the windows. I figured from cats, it had to be. The front porch light lingered, barely illuminating the steps. When I parked out front, I hesitated. Something about the house tonight, it felt different, darker, like it was waiting for me. There were bags of trash all over the porch, and a small recliner rotting next to the front door. The place was pretty disgusting from top to bottom, but it was a complete reflection of the lady that lived inside. I took a deep breath, shook off that creeping feeling crawling up my spine, and just grabbed the order. I walked up her porch. I noticed a sour stench in the air, almost like rotting meat mixed with something else, sweat maybe? I couldn't quite place it. The kind of smell that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I knocked once and the door creaked open on its own. It was the last thing in the world that I wanted to happen. It wasn't the first time her door had been left unlocked, but tonight it swung inward with a slow groan, like it had been waiting for me. The darkness inside was absolute. The light from the street barely even penetrated past that threshold, swallowed by the shadowy gloom beyond. The smell now hit me harder, thicker, rancid. Elaine? I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. I stepped inside, the floor creaking underneath my weight. Elaine, your food is here. I should have left, and I know that now, but in the moment, I thought maybe she'd fallen or was too sick to come to the door. And despite everything, I didn't want to just leave the food outside. My eyes adjusted to the dim light spilling from somewhere deep within the house. The glow of a flickering lamp, or TV maybe. But the living room was worse than I'd ever seen. Clothes and papers were strewn across the floor. Half-empty food containers, empty bottles. I set the food down on the kitchen counter, clearing up a small space along the clutter. My feet almost sank into the carpet. It was damp with something I didn't want to think about. As I moved toward the hallway, I saw shadows shifting at the edge of my vision, almost like something was lurking just out of sight. At this point, I was convinced that she was hurt. Maybe she had fallen. "Elaine!" I called out again, this time more urgently. From somewhere deep in the hall, I heard it, a faint voice, barely even above a whisper. "In here! Help me!" That was her voice, but it didn't sound right. It was too weak, too distant. Almost like she was calling out for me from the bottom of a well. I hesitated in the doorway of the hall, glancing back at the front door, which seemed farther away now. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but then I thought, what if she really did need my help? I crept down the hallway, walls narrowing as if they were closing in around me. That smell was unbearable now, like a festering wound that had just been left to rot. I reached the bedroom door, slightly ajar, and the dim light flickered inside. I pushed it open slowly. There she was lying on the bed, sheets tangled around her massive frame. Elaine, her body barely covered, skin pale, glistening with sweat. She smiled weakly at me, but it wasn't a smile of gratitude, it was something else. "Come in," she said, her voice thick and slurred. "I need you." I froze, my stomach turning even more. There was just something deeply wrong about the way that she was lying there, the way she was looking at me. I took a step back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. She was totally naked, all of her parts totally exposed, beckoning me with one finger to join her in bed. I brought your food," I stammered out, already backing out of the room. "I should go." Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, low and raspy from somewhere behind me. "No, don't leave. She needs you." I whipped around. In the shadows at the end of the hall stood a man, and I recognized him immediately. A homeless guy that I'd seen hanging around downtown, wandering aimlessly. His clothes were filthy, his face unshaven. But what stood out most was the way that he was watching me. His eyes were wide, gleaming with something manic, something desperate. There aren't many homeless folks in our little community, so it was easy to put together where I knew him from. Still, there was something off, like he was out of his fucking mind. "She needs you to stay," he said again, stepping forward, his dirty hand outstretched toward me. "You can help her." I backed up to the doorframe, my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't think," I began, but he cut me off, his voice rising. "She's sick. Can't you see that? You gotta give her what she needs." And then he winked at me. I felt my body tense as he moved closer. His steps were deliberate, his breath ragged. I glanced back into the room where Elaine was still watching me with that weird grin, her hands still beckoning to me to come closer. I could feel those walls closing in, air around me thickening. This wasn't just some strange request, it was something else entirely, something much darker and totally depraved. My back finally hit the wall and the weight of the situation sank in. I was trapped. The man continued to edge closer, his dirty clothes reeking of sour sweat and something else. His breath was hot and damp, filling that narrow hallway as he muttered again. "You need to help her. You came here to help her, didn't you? Give her your load, delivery boy." "I'm just a delivery guy," I stammered out, my throat dry. "I'm just here to drop off the food and I really need to get going. I've got other deliveries." "Deliveries can wait," he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the stifling air like a knife. He was only inches from me now, close enough that I could see the sores on his skin, the yellowed white of his eyes darting back and forth, scanning me like I was prey. "Elaine's hungry. She's been waiting for you. Give it to her, man, and let me watch." Behind me, Elaine's voice chimed in sickly sweet. "Please, don't go." She drew out the words, each syllable dripping with a mixture of desperation, and that made my skin crawl even more. Just stay for a while, you'll like it. We'll take care of you. I whipped my head back toward her. She'd pulled herself halfway up, her large pale body barely concealed by the thin sheet now tangled around her legs. The dim light of the room caught the gleam of sweat on her face, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of filth that she lived in. The bed was stained, dark splotches marking the mattress, and there was an overwhelming smell of mold and decay that almost seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. I gagged as the bile rose up in my throat. The man's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was clammy, his nails filthy, digging into my skin. "You don't get to leave," he growled, pulling me back towards the bedroom. "Elaine wants you to stay." "No!" I shouted out, finally yanking my arm free with all the strength that I could muster up. The sudden movement sent me stumbling backward, my shoulder crashing into the doorframe. "I'm not staying. I'm not part of whatever this is. You two have your own fun." The man's face twisted into this ugly snarl, his lips curling back to reveal yellow, cracked teeth. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous now. "Not until she's had what she wants. You're gonna tag that man. Hard, just do it." I didn't want to find out what that meant. I turned and just bolted down the hallway, feet pounding against the worn carpet as I raced towards the front door. Behind me, I could hear that man's heavy footsteps, that ragged breath coming right after me as he chased. Elaine's voice followed me, sickly and sing-songy. "Come back, don't run away." I reached the front door and yanked it open with trembling hands. The cold night air hit my face before I could fully escape. And that's when I felt a hand claw at the back of my shirt, pulling me backward. I turned just in time to see that man, eyes wild, trying to drag me back into the house. "Come on, bro," he shouted out. With a desperate burst of strength, I twisted out of his grasp, stumbled down the porch step, and ran toward my car. I fumbled for my keys, and I finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut and locked it. The man stood at the edge of the porch, his shadow looming in the dim light, his eyes locked on me with this crazed intensity. For a moment, we just stared at one another, the air between us thick with tension. He didn't move, he just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he continued to watch me. Then he slowly raised his hand and pointed at me, lips curling up. "You'll be back," he said, his voice barely audible through my closed car window. "You'll come back." I didn't waste another second. I started up my engine and peeled out of that driveway, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I sped away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The image of Elaine and that man, whatever the hell they were planning on doing, was burned into my mind. I just kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. When I finally pulled into the parking lot behind Delivery Delight's office, I felt like I could breathe again. That oppressive weight that had clung to me inside that house almost seemed to be lifted completely. But the unease, the crawling sensation on the back of my neck, remained. I sat in my car for a while, heart gradually slowing down, trying to make sense of that entire situation. How did I even end up in that? I delivered to her before, sure, but this was obviously completely different. This wasn't just an awkward old lady being inappropriate. This was something else entirely, something darker and more insidious. The hell was that guy? I pulled out my phone and dialed my boss, the owner of Delivering Delights. Even though it was late, the line rang twice and then a groggy voice answered.
Yeah, what's up?
I just left Elaine's house, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though it was still trembling. Something weird happened, and I think she's got some guy staying with her. He tried to grab me, and I barely got away. There was a pause on the other end of the line.
What do you mean, some guy?
I don't know who he is, I said, words spilling out now. He's homeless, I think. I've seen him around town, but he was there and he tried to pull me back into the house. Told me I couldn't leave. My boss sighed heavily.
Look, man, Lane's definitely got some issues, okay? We've had trouble with her in the past, but nothing like this. I will talk to the police and see what they want to do. In the meantime, just take the rest of the night off and we'll figure everything else out.
I just hung up, feeling no more reassured than I had before. As I sat in my darkened car, the weight of what had just happened finally settled in. I could still feel that man's clammy grip on my arm. I could still hear Elaine's eerie voice calling out to me, beckoning me back. I didn't even go home straight away. Instead, I just drove aimlessly throughout our quiet streets of our town, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, the feeling that was on my arm. Every time I passed a shadowy alley or an empty street corner, I half expected to see that man standing there, waiting for me. The next morning, I went back to the office to follow up with my boss. I needed closure, some kind of explanation, anything to make sense of the madness that I'd experienced last night. When I walked in, my boss was sitting behind his desk looking a lot more tired than usual. "Did you hear back from the cops?" I asked, sitting down from him. He nodded slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, turns out Elaine's been letting that guy stay with her for a while now. Apparently she met him in a town a couple of days ago and brought him home, and they've been, I guess involved?" "Involved?" I echoed, immediately feeling my stomach churn. "Yeah," my boss sighed, clearly uncomfortable. It's weird and messed up, but they're consenting adults. There's not much we can do. The cops went over and talked to them, but they didn't arrest the guy. He technically wasn't doing anything illegal." I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying to me. "So, that's it? Nothing's gonna happen? Nothing illegal?" His hands were all over me. He chased me. He tried to pull me back in the house. My boss leaned back in his chair, looking at me with tired eyes. "Look, I get it. It's creepy as hell, but there's nothing more we can do. Just stay clear of her from now on, all right? If she calls in an order, I'll send somebody else. As for pressing any charges, it's your word against theirs. And they're both saying he never touched you. It is what it is." I nodded, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I left the office and went home, and ended up quitting the following week. I just couldn't do it after that, for everything that happened, and I never saw those two again. And if I do, I'll definitely run the other way. I've been delivering pizzas for almost 2 years now. Not exactly what I imagined doing when I moved to the sleepy town, but it pays the bills. I started out just looking for something to keep me afloat until I could land a job in marketing. But the more I did, the more I realized that delivery work kind of gives me the freedom that I needed. At least in theory. But if there's one thing I learned from all those shifts, it's being a woman in this industry turns the most mundane job into a constant game of cat and mouse. Everybody becomes a potential threat the moment they see me standing in their door. What's just a delivery to a guy becomes something entirely different when it's me, 5'3" and barely pushing 120 pounds, standing there clutching a pizza box almost like a shield. The regulars are pretty harmless mostly. Families with kids, elderly couples, office workers stuck in for late night shifts. But then there are the ones who wait for that knock, who open the door just a little too eagerly, their eyes lingering a bit too much. The ones asking for my name, even though it's clearly printed on the receipt, lean in just a little too close when they hand over the cash. I try to keep my distance, always make sure I stand just far enough away that when the door opens there's some space between us. I learned these tricks fast, but despite all the creeps, I've managed to keep things pretty professional. No close calls, no moments where my gut was screaming at me to run. Until a few days ago. It was a Friday afternoon just after lunch, the kind of shift where you get lulled into a false sense of security. The sun's shining and the roads are clear. You start to forget about how quickly things could change. I headed out to pick up an order when I noticed a truck behind me, big Chevy, lifted, with one of those steel bumpers that look like it's made for plowing through things. One of those trucks that screams, "I don't give a damn about anybody else on the road. Country boys can't survive." There was a Confederate flag flapping proudly on the back, and as soon as I saw it, my stomach tightened. At first, I thought they were just impatient, like most of the guys who drove those trucks, riding too close, itching to pass me. But then the engine revved. The front of the truck lurched closer, almost kissing the back of my little Toyota. The sun gleamed off the windshield, but I could still make out their shadowy forms behind the glass. There was two of them, leaning forward like they were gearing up for something. I tried to remain calm and ease my foot off the gas, hoping they'd just pass me. But they didn't. Instead, they swung out to the side, overtaking me on the little narrow 2-lane road, and then cut sharply in front, forcing me onto the shoulder. Gravel spit up underneath my tires as I fought to regain control. They honked loud and long, and I caught a glimpse of one of them leaning out the window laughing as they sped off down the road. I sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, probably just my app letting me know I had another order coming through, but I still didn't move. I stared at those disappearing taillights, feeling the adrenaline surge through me like electricity. Didn't really have time to get their license plate, and even if I had, what was I gonna do with it? Call the cops and say I got run off the road? I doubt they even care. So I did the only thing I really could. I shook it off, took a deep breath, and got back on the road. Besides, what were the chances I'd ever see those two guys again? 2 days later, I got an order that changed everything. It came in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to sink behind the trees. The address was on the outskirts of town, a place that I'd never seen before, which isn't exactly rare, but it just felt off. Maybe it was the fact that the customer had called in the order instead of using the app. We barely got phone orders anymore. Everybody just used the app. It was convenient, why not? And yet, here I was, driving down a stretch of highway I'd only ever heard about, heading toward a customer I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want to meet. The driveway itself was long, winding through these thick patches of trees. Just a narrow dirt road, and it stretched out into the woods. As soon as I turned onto it, I felt my stomach twist up in knots. The trees were dense, and their shadows swallowed up the last bit of daylight that was around me, casting everything in this oppressive gloom. My car's headlights barely pierced the darkness, and I had to slow down to crawl just to keep from hitting any potholes. And that's when I saw, just parked up ahead of me, off to the side of the driveway, that same truck from 2 days ago. My heart dropped immediately. There was no mistaking it. That big Chevy with a Confederate flag hanging directly from the tailgate, just sitting there like it'd been waiting for me. The same truck that had run me off the road just 2 days prior. I stopped my car, my pulse now pounding in my ears. I could feel the weight of the woods and the situation pressing in around me from all sides. The silence was thick, too still. For a brief moment, I thought about backing out, turning around and just leaving. But then I glanced at the pizza boxes in the seat next to me. What was I gonna do, just abandon the order? No, I could not afford to lose out on the tip, especially after such a slow week. Still, I did not want them to see my car. So I ended up parking behind this clump of trees where my car would be barely visible if they came down the driveway. I took my phone out and checked the signal. 1 bar, but at least it wasn't completely cut off. I scrolled to my boss's number, thumb hovering over the call button just in case. I grabbed the pizzas, locked the car, and started down that dirt path toward the house. It wasn't too far, maybe 100 yards or so, but every step it felt heavy, like I was walking into a trap, one that I couldn't see just yet. Everything around me was like hypersensitive. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and rotting wood. And the silence came in so thick I could hear my own breathing. It was almost too loud in my ears. As the house came into view through the trees, it was old, a sagging thing. The kind of place that looked like it had been cobbled together over the years by somebody who really didn't care about appearances. The porch sagged in the middle. The windows were covered with grime, making it almost impossible to see inside. There was a gate separating the house from the rest of the property. And as I approached, I noticed a figure sitting on the porch, rocking back and forth in an old wooden chair. He was just staring at me. My breath caught in my throat as the man stood up and gave this lazy wave. I recognized him immediately. He was one of the ones from the truck, the ones who'd laughed at me as they forced me off the road. He was wearing that same dirty baseball cap, shirt stained, stretched all over his bulky frame. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You the pizza girl?" I nodded, throat too tight to respond, hands now gripping the pizza boxes so hard I thought I was going to crush them. He grinned, showing off his set of yellow teeth. "Didn't think we'd see you again so soon." My stomach churned. The guy stepped off the porch and started walking around the side of the house, disappearing from my view. I hesitated for a moment, standing there at the gate, unsure of what to do next. But then another man emerged from the back of the house, this one taller and skinnier, with that same greasy look though. He waved, just like the first guy. "Sorry about the other day," he called out, walking toward the gate. "Didn't mean to scare you, we were just having some fun, you know? But I do feel bad about it, I really do." He came in closer, just enough that I could see the glint in his eyes. He wasn't sorry, he was playing with me. "I got a big tip for you," he said, pulling out a wad of cash from his pocket. "Come on inside, we'll make it right." I hesitated, glancing back at my car hidden in the trees. My phone was still in my pocket. I could call my boss and tell him what was happening, but then what? Would anybody even get out here in time? The man waved me forward, cash still in hand. "Come on now, we don't bite." "Not unless you want us to." He laughed, a low, ugly sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I stepped through the gate, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. I could feel the weight of the pizzas in my hand, but it wasn't the boxes that felt heavy. It was the sense that I'd crossed a line, one that I might not come back from. I walked toward the house, my steps slow and deliberate. The man with the cash just kept smiling, waving me on. The other guy reappeared around the corner, standing there with something in his hands. I squinted, trying to make out what it was in the fading light. Then I realized what it was. Leashes, thick, heavy leashes, and at the end of them, 2 snarling Rottweilers. The dogs were straining against their collars, eyes locked onto me, teeth bared, growling so low that it rumbled in the pit of my stomach. The man holding the leashes grinned wider, and without a word, he let them go. I didn't think, I didn't have time, I just ran. The dogs were on me in seconds. Their growls turned into vicious barks as they tore across the yard. I could hear the men laughing behind me, shouting and clapping. It was all some kind of twisted game. My legs burning as I sprinted back towards the gate. The sound of paws pounding the dirt was too close, way too close. And then, in a moment of pure panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the pizza boxes over my shoulder. The dogs lunged at the boxes, tearing into them with these frenzied snarls. Then I used that distraction to bolt through the gate and sprint back towards my car. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys, but somehow, thankfully, I managed to get the door open and throw myself inside. The tire spun in the dirt as I floored it, the truck and the house disappearing in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the shop. My hands were trembling as I told my manager about what had just taken place. He didn't believe me at first, I mean, who would? But when I showed him the video I recorded on my phone of one of the men laughing as the dogs chased me, his face then went pale. We reported it to the police and, of course, they didn't do much. Just gave this guy a citation and a fine, but it turns out his name was Randall. He'd been a menace to the town for years, in and out of jail, always stirring up some kind of trouble. After what happened with me, people stopped putting up with his bullshit. The town finally turned on him for the first time, and folks didn't hesitate to call the cops on him when he stepped out of line. As for me, I'm still delivering pizzas, but every now and again when I pull up to a house, I make damn sure that I park where I can make a quick getaway.